Today on Uncommon Knowledge, why Charles Darwin should be spinning in his grave.
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, science, skepticism, and the debate over evolution. Last October, the school board in Dover, Pennsylvania, instructed its high school biology teachers to begin classes on evolution with this statement: Darwin's theory is a theory, not a fact. Gaps in the theory exist. As an alternative to evolution, the school board recommended teaching intelligent design, a theory that holds that life on Earth could not have developed at random. Well, are there gaps in the theory of evolution that undermine its credibility? What are we to make of this new theory of intelligent design? And what should we be teaching our school children about the development of life on Earth? Joining us today, two guests. Jonathan Wells is a biologist and a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. Massimo Pigliucci is a professor of life sciences at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. This past winter, the ACLU and the Americans United for Separation of Church and State filed a lawsuit against the school board of Dover, Pennsylvania, which had voted to require biology teachers to introduce students to the alternative theory, alternative to evolution, known as intelligent design. Richard Thompson, president of the Thomas More Law Center, a public interest law firm, quote, "Students will be made aware of gaps and problems in evolution. What's wrong with that?" Close quote. Massimo, what is wrong with that?
Nothing except the fact that intelligent design is not a scientific theory.
Jonathan?
Well, I think intelligent design is a scientific theory, but I would not require students to study it because it's too new.
But this notion of at least making students aware of, his phrase is gaps and problems in evolution.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. All right. Now, let's define terms a little bit, as much as television will bear. Evolution gets used lots of different ways. How would you define evolution for the purposes of this program, of this discussion?
Well, I would define it as Darwin's theory of evolution, as modified in modern thinking. But Darwin called it descent with modification, which has two aspects. One is the common ancestry of all living things who are descended from a common ancestor. And the second aspect is modification, which for Darwin was due primarily to natural selection acting on random variations.
Random variation, all right, common ancestors, ancestor, and then random variation and natural selection. Is that an adequate?
That's largely correct.
Right.
The modern version adds several more mechanisms to the modification part. So modern evolutionary theory now accepts not only natural selection, but a series of other developmental or genetic mechanisms that contribute to change. But it would still be true that the modern biologists consider natural selection the only known mechanism that can create adaptation, which is that can create a fit between the environment, the organism and the environment.
Okay, and without yet being argumentative, that is, we'll save that for a moment, but just give us a working definition of intelligent design.
Intelligent design theory holds that some features of the universe, including some features of living things, are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than undirected natural causes such as variation and selection.
So some sense of purpose or will as opposed to sheer randomness.
I think that's I'm sorry if I cut in, but that's a false dichotomy, which we need to clarify immediately. The alternative, I think, it's not pure randomness, because the theory of evolution by natural selection has a random component, as Jonathan pointed out a minute ago, which is the origin of variation through, for example, genetic mutations. But there is a non-random component. Natural selection is not a random process. It is a result of competition between organisms to exploit resources in the environment, and that's not random at all. So when we're talking about the modern theory of evolution, there is a component that is non-random.
That is
although it's
non-random.
not conscious, of course.
Right, of course. So what, I'm
I
just looking for
agree.
a clear distinction, some clear way of understanding intelligent design.
Well, that's why I said undirected natural causes. It's true that there is a non-random component, but in Darwinian theory, it's still undirected. There's no goal involved.
There's no purpose, there's no consciousness.
Intelligent design does not necessarily require what, when you go to synagogue or church on Sunday, gets described as God.
That's correct. It does not.
Does not.
All intelligent design does is tries to infer from evidence whether a certain feature is designed or not.
Okay.
And it may or may not.
Let's take a look at some of the alleged problems with the theory of evolution, beginning with problems in practice. If indeed all forms of life are descended from one or a few common ancestors, then, as I understand it, you'd expect the fossil record to look like a tree, branchings from a common trunk. But instead, what you get in the fossil record is large numbers of animal forms appearing more or less all at once in the so-called Cambrian explosion. Right? Have I described that correctly, and is that a problem?
Not exactly.
Go ahead, you comment, and then you comment. Jonathan?
Well, I would call that a fair description of the problem. Darwin himself considered the branching tree model to be the one that follows from his theory, and yet when we look at the fossil record, we don't find that branching tree pattern. And so there is a discrepancy between the pattern and the evidence.
Massimo?
I don't think so, or at least the discrepancy is certainly not the type of discrepancy that intelligent design proponents would like to see. We don't know, first of all, if there was one common ancestor or a pool of common ancestors if we go all the way back to the origin of life. That is under debate, and it's not a crucial component of modern evolutionary theory. It would work either way. We also need to move a little past Darwin himself, because science has this nice feature that it does evolve and progress. And so just in the same way in which modern physicists don't feel bound by what Newton said, modern biologists don't feel like Darwin is sort of a Bible that needs to be followed. So let's talk about the modern theory of evolution.
Right.
The modern theory of evolution does predict a generally branching pattern, meaning that the more time it passes, the more living beings diverge from each other by a variety of mechanisms. That is largely what we see. The question here is, what happened at the origin of the large group of organisms, of animals that we see today, way back in Precambrian times? So we're talking about more than 500 million years ago. And we have very little knowledge about what happened. We have
very little knowledge.
Very little knowledge, simply because there's very little fossil record to go about.
What is it that's special about the Cambrian period, where suddenly there's a large fossil record, and then you go before Cambria, and it dries up?
A couple of things. First of all, it's not that sudden. It is a sudden explosion that actually lasted anywhere between 30 and 50 million years, which is not a minor amount of time. Of course, it's minor compared to the entire span of life on Earth, but it is not a sudden thing that happened. The other thing is, one of the things that probably happened at that time was the transition between forms that have a much more difficult time fossilizing because they don't have hard parts, to forms that do fossilize more easily.
Because they have bones or shells.
Because they have bones and shells and things of that sort. So,
well, if I may, I'll say three things briefly. One is, one does not have to be an intelligent design advocate to criticize Darwin's theory. All one has to be is a scientist and look at the evidence and compare it to the theory. Second of all, I do think the Cambrian explosion was quite sudden, geologically speaking. If you can imagine walking from one end of a football field to another, it's as though you went all the way to about the 80-yard line with single-celled organisms, and then in the space of a single step, the major kinds of animals appear relatively suddenly.
Can I just, that's a problem. It's not a smooth transition that you'd like to see if you were taking the theory of evolution and digging away and hoping to confirm it smoothly and neatly, right?
It's not what Darwin expected.
But it's not a fatal problem.
It's hard to say you have a fatal problem for a theory as sweeping as Darwinian evolution. So I would not call it a fatal problem. I would call it a serious problem, as Darwin himself did.
Okay.
And if I can make my third point.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Briefly, I do not think that the Cambrian explosion can be explained by the appearance of skeletons and hard parts. After all, 2/3 of the animals in the Cambrian explosion didn't have them. And we have many soft-bodied animals, excuse me, before that. in fossil records. So it was not the sudden appearance of skeletons that made
That's
the Cambrian
correct, but
explosion.
those animals that we do have before the Precambrian, before the Cambrian, in fact, do have phylogenetic relationships with the ones that came after.
Next
I like
practical-
to make a point before we go ahead, which is this idea that in science, really, alternative theories work by proposing, science moves by proposing better theories, better explanations. It's not that one can say something is wrong, therefore that's it. We should stop there. So the question is, what is the alternative? And I'd like to ask Jonathan.
No,
if he
no, no.
thinks,
The alternative comes later. The
but if
alternative
he
comes
thinks,
later.
now I'm talking about the specific of the Cambrian explosion.
Oh, all right, go
if he
ahead.
thinks that the modern Darwinian, neo-Darwinian theory does not have a good explanation for the Cambrian explosion, does he think that therefore an intelligent designer came on Earth 650 million years ago and just put the animals there?
Well, Massimo, I disagree with you that one needs a better theory to criticize an existing theory. For example, what if
science works?
not necessarily? What if
Give me
I
another
Well, there's
example.
certainly two separate steps. The first step is to say, wait a minute, there are problems here. And the person who says that ought to be lauded if he's right, because then it opens doors to the second step, which is finding a better theory. But you can't say you must have both bundled together. You must have both the criticism and the solution, or that places too high a burden on people, surely, as a matter of scientific
Philosophers of science have shown that science actually works by competing theories. It never works by somebody getting up and say, well, this is wrong, and that's the end of the day.
No, but the person who says this is wrong can stimulate the person 2 rows over who says, oh, I think you're right about that, and here's a solution.
Sure.
All right, look, next.
Now on to objections to the theory of evolution on matters of principle.
Michael Behe and his notion of, quote, irreducible complexity. Behe draws a parallel with a simple mousetrap. A mousetrap is made up of a dozen or so parts. If a single one is missing, the mousetrap doesn't work. Likewise, a large number of functions that take place at the molecular level, the biochemistry of light detection, for example, requires a whole series of complex interaction among many different molecules, each highly specialized. And the notion here is that the necessary combination of molecules to enable an organism to detect light simply could not be built up haphazardly or piecemeal. You have to have the whole structure spring into being at once, or you don't get the adaptive advantage. Is that, in principle, a serious problem with evolution? Jonathan, Behe's onto something there?
Well, Darwin thought in principle that this is a problem. He said if
He
a
saw it
single,
himself.
well, he didn't see that particular example, but he said if any example could be found of a feature that could not be built up through slight successive modifications, that would be a fatal blow to his theory. Now, Michael Behe claims to have found several examples of that. Those examples are hotly debated in the scientific literature.
What's your own view? Are you persuaded by him? Are you open-minded about it? Or is he onto something in principle?
I think in principle he is onto something. Now, whether any specific example will stand up to scientific scrutiny remains to be seen. But in principle, there's a problem here.
You don't buy this at all?
No, first of all, there's no scientific debate about any of the examples that are in Michael Behe's book, which I have read. Not only that, but the very idea of reducible complexity is actually being debunked from a philosophy of science perspective. Let me go back to Behe's major example, as you pointed out, or metaphor, I guess, of the
mousetrap?
The mousetrap.
All right.
There's two things that are clearly
Good,
wrong
because
with
that's
that.
something I think I can actually follow.
Right. There are two things that are clearly wrong about that metaphor. First of all, in the case of the mousetrap, we do know that it was intelligently designed.
Certainly.
So that's what in philosophy is called begging the question. I mean, you're sort of assuming, you're starting with an example in which you already know that there is design, so of course you're going to conclude that there is design. It's an example that it makes for a poor analogy, because in the case of evolutionary biology, we're trying to understand how the appearance of design, that is how the fit between organisms and environments comes about. If you said that that's analogous to a clear artifact that we know is the result of intelligent design, it's not clear to me how the analogy is going to work. But the interesting thing is that there is a website put up by a biologist who actually shows that you can have simpler versions of the mousetrap compared to the ones that Behe had in his book. So, in fact, by his own example, irreducible complexity doesn't stand up, because even in mousetraps, you can have
this notion that the human eyeball, or the simple sort of light detection, cell-by-cell light detection, the notion that that's such a complicated mechanism that it couldn't have arisen haphazardly or piecemeal, that just has no standing in
It has no standing, especially in that particular example, because it turns out actually that there is very good evidence of how the complex vertebrate eye has evolved. We actually do know many of the intermediate steps. Some of them are found in the fossil record, and some of them are found living today. There are organisms, obviously, the ones living today are not intermediate steps, but they are simplified versions of eyes and light receptors. They are available, and there's very nice models. That's right. And there are very nice models that show how you can build gradually from a light receptor to a complex eye.
So Behe's onto something in principle in your view, but there's no specific example. Even light receptors could have arisen.
Well, actually, Behe's argument is not about the evolution of the vertebrate eye, but about the origin of the light receiving mechanism itself. Behe's a biochemist, and so he studies the molecular mechanism that actually detects photons, that detects light. And he argues, I think persuasively, that that is irreducibly complex. And let me just disagree briefly and say that there is a scientific controversy in the scientific literature on this issue.
Now a closer look at intelligent design itself.
Is intelligent design merely a critique? Is it simply a way of pointing out limits and gaps in the theory of evolution? Or is it more positive than that? Does it actually give us a framework, a new way of thinking about the evidence?
I would say it's not merely a critique, although that critique is important because in the hands of many evolutionary biologists, Darwin's theory, the modern version of it, is used to rule out design, to make it merely an appearance. So the critique of evolutionary theory is part of the package, but intelligent design theory, in order to be a science, has to stand on its own 2 feet. And it does that by proposing a hypothesis.
All right.
And providing criteria by which that hypothesis can be tested.
The hypothesis is?
That feature X, whether in the universe or in some particular living thing, is a product of intelligent design.
How would you go about testing that?
The same way we, in our daily lives, test...
Hold on. You're moving a little too fast. A product of intelligent design means what? How do you proceed even thinking about that without ending up in the lap of God or thinking about a first mover in some sort of Thomistic way?
Well, in our daily lives, we routinely make design inferences. We look at situations or things, and we know almost intuitively often that something is designed or it's not.
Here's an example.
Right.
Or watch is the classic example.
Bill Clinton's famous quip that if you see a turtle on a fence post, you know it didn't get there by accident.
I hadn't heard that one.
That's a good one. Yeah.
So the question is, do we have a hypothesis that we can test against the evidence?
Right.
I think we do. Now, having done that, what can we say? In intelligent design theory, all we can say is this feature provisionally appears to be a product of design.
But now to Massimo's question, how do you test that hypothesis?
Well, you mentioned Michael Behe. Irreducible complexity is one criterion. William Dembski, another design theorist, has a broader criterion that he calls specified complexity. Now, if I drop a pile of a handful of Scrabble pieces on the floor with letters on their wooden blocks, the pattern that those blocks form will be very complicated, very complex, but it won't be designed. It'll just be an accident. It's a pile on the floor. But now, if I arrange those letters to spell an English sentence, the pattern is not only complex, it's specified in the sense that it fits an independently specified pattern.
But once again, that begs the question, because the whole point of evolutionary theory evolution by natural selection is in fact to explain that appearance of complex and orderly patterns by means of a natural process. I don't think...
Wait. You posit the natural process. In other words...
Yes, well, there is a difference there. For one thing, natural selection can be measured empirically under field conditions. I mean, my students do that all the time. You cannot measure the activity of the intelligent designer. But there is a more fundamental problem that I see that I would like Jonathan to have.
In other words, you start by saying we're going to rule out any notion of anything anatural or anything that cannot be.
That's not just evolutionary theory. That's science in general. So science in general cannot start with the assumption that there is a supernatural intervention, which is, let's make a distinction here.
Then the question to you is, how do you say intelligent design explains something better than does evolutionary theory?
Well, let me say two things.
Because that's the point, isn't it? To get something that's a better fit with the evidence, right?
Yes. One thing I would say is that natural selection has not and has never been shown to be able to produce specified
But
complexity.
that's a negative statement.
Let me
and it's not
finish.
true.
Let me finish.
Go ahead.
Let me finish. On the other hand, you have just heard another definition of science here, which is not the same as the one we agreed upon a few minutes ago. The definition of science I gave, the essence of science, is the testing of hypotheses against the evidence. The definition we just heard is that science starts with the assumption that everything in the world can be explained without recourse to supernatural causes. That's a different
No, I'm sorry,
definition.
Jonathan. There's no difference there for the simple reason that you cannot test hypotheses about the supernatural.
But if your attitude is to test hypotheses, you can reach a point where you say, you know what, I don't know the answer to that
That's
question.
correct, and scientists do that all the time. But there is a crucial difference between saying, I don't know the answer, which, as I said, we do all the times, and saying, therefore, the answer is there is an intelligent design.
So intelligent design,
First of all, I do not think intelligent design theory is merely equivalent to saying, I don't know. The problem with using natural selection as an explanation, using Darwinian evolution as an explanation, is that all too often, I find, it's the default explanation. That is, instead of saying we don't know, we say, well, it must have been natural selection because we know that there's no intelligent design here. Okay. That is, it's merely an appearance, as you said.
I've never heard a scientist put it that way.
I have read it hundreds of times. Second of
This brings us right back to the question with which we started. What should American school children be taught?
Cobb County, Georgia, the school board put a sticker in science books saying, I don't know the exact words, but they were something very close to, evolution is a theory, not a fact. And the judge ruled that they had to peel all those stickers out of the textbooks because that was an unfair endorsement of religion. I'm not asking you to parse the Constitution. I'm asking you what school children should be taught. Evolution pure and simple, or evolution is here and other people take this view and other people take another. How would you handle the design of textbooks?
Well, I absolutely think science students should be taught Darwin's theory of evolution and the modern versions of it. Because it's so important and so influential in modern biology. But I also think they should be taught scientific evidence and arguments against it as well as for it. And if you question whether there's a controversy, you have here two biologists, and you've heard the controversy, at least a little snippet of it. So there is a controversy here, and I think students should be aware of that. Now, should they be forced to study intelligent design? I don't think so. But if the question comes up, why not look into it?
I think that the wording that the judge used in that particular decision you referred to is important there. The judge said that the sticker needs to be eliminated because it unfairly singles out the theory of evolution. It makes it, in other words, makes the student think that there is something special about the theory of evolution that is particularly controversial as opposed to other scientific theories. So if we're talking about, which is not true, the scientific theory of evolution is as controversial in biology as quantum mechanics or relativity theory are controversial in physics. And by the way, they are controversial because, for example, relativity theory makes certain predictions that are at odds with quantum mechanical predictions in certain areas, which is one of the reasons why there are still active physicists working out there and having a professional career as researchers. In the same way, of course, evolutionary theory does not explain everything that we know about living organisms, which is why there are active professional evolutionary biologists like myself try to work on these things. But one thing is to point out to the students that science is always in the making, it always changes, so what we think is correct today, a correct interpretation today may be different, and here are the areas of actual controversy.
So as a working scientist, then, you have absolutely no qualm about saying to students, look, this is a theory, this is a theory, this is a theory. They all have their limitations. Science is always in the making. Now, would you also, however, have no qualms about including a paragraph or two on intelligent design?
I do have qualms for the simple reason that at the moment, and as far as I can see forever, but at the moment, certainly, intelligent design is not a scientific theory, and as such, should not be brought up in a science class. Now, if we did have philosophy classes in high schools, in European high schools, you do have to teach philosophy for about three years or so in the curriculum. And in a philosophy class, intelligent design theory does have a place. But it is not a scientific theory. In fact, Jonathan agreed basically very much with it a few minutes ago.
But it's not a scientific theory?
That's right. You said that it does not make, at the moment, you do not
Here's the
make...
Massimo solution. The Massimo solution is teach intelligent design, but teach it in philosophy class. What do you think?
Well, I do think intelligent design is a scientific theory. I don't think it gets you to the intelligent designer. That may be the aspect you're talking about. But the problem is students are already being taught about intelligent design. The state of Texas last year adopted a bunch of textbooks, several of which have sections on intelligent design.
And the ACLU hasn't all over them?
Well, because those sections caricature the theory and discard it. Okay, now if students are going to be forced to read about intelligent design, as they will be in Texas if these textbooks are used, then shouldn't the theory be presented fairly and with adequate time for students to debate the merits?
Last question. A decade from now, I'm not asking you to say whether you think intelligent design is worthy of this treatment or not. I'm asking you to give me a prediction about the way you think things are moving. A decade from now, will intelligent design receive at least a brief and respectful treatment in American science textbooks? What do you think?
Not unless there is a major change in the Supreme Court which will allow the teaching of creationism in the public schools. That may happen, but that would be a result of politics, not science.
Jonathan.
I don't think intelligent design is creationism. I don't think the Supreme Court will have anything to do with it. I think intelligent design will win the scientific community, and therefore...
In a decade, you think things are moving reasonably quickly?
Oh, I'll give it 2 decades.
2 decades.
But it'll be on its way in a decade.
Massimo, Jonathan, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.
We welcome your comments on this week's show. Our email address, comments@uncommonknowledge.tv. For more information about Uncommon Knowledge, please visit our website, www.uncommonknowledge.tv.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.